was from Florida Gulf Coast University.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk today about some of my seagrass monitoring work in Estero Bay. And a lot of this is very fresh, and if I was giving the presentation 2 weeks later, I'd actually have another set of data to discuss. But the data that I'm going to discuss this time is through 2018. So I called this Towards a Better Assessment of Estero Bay Seagrass Health Status and Environmental Stressors, because it's really a work in progress. We're trying to bring together different types of existing monitoring and develop some new types of monitoring to get a better read on how seagrass in Estero Bay is really doing. And a picture that I have here is from one of my graduate students' projects in 2017 and 2018, where she did a synoptic survey of seagrass abundance in Estero Bay. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk about first is some important people that have contributed to this work in progress. I'm going to give just a brief overview on the Estero Bay ecosystem and the seagrass in it. Then I'm going to focus on my graduate student's thesis results with her analysis of historical trends in seagrass abundance, and also her vetting of a new monitoring method. And I'm going to talk about what we're doing now to get even better data about seagrass in Estero Bay. Next slide, please. So the people who I really owe a lot of credit to for what we're talking about today include Althea Hodeling. When she was a graduate student at the University of Florida, she did a great study with Bob Sweat of seagrasses in Estero Bay in relation to water quality. And in particular, she came up with a network of water quality, particularly optical water quality monitoring sites that my own graduate student, Lisa Rickards, used later and combined with seagrass monitoring for a better relation to look at the relationship of seagrass and optical water quality in more detail. And through this all, we've had a lot of help from the Estero Bay Aquatic Preserve staff. They've been very generous in helping us use their seagrass transect monitoring data and their continuous water quality monitoring data and other shared data resources. Rebecca Cray-Flynn gave a great talk about the water quality monitoring that they're doing yesterday. And I should also credit the South Florida Water Management District and many others for their data contributions to our historical analyses of seagrass abundance in the bay and our continuing monitoring efforts. Next slide. So Estero Bay is, I believe, the most southerly estuary in the Charlotte Harbor region. It's 4,500 hectares. It's shallow. On average, the depth is only about 1 meter. There's 5 freshwater tributaries, and this has been managed as an aquatic preserve since the late 1960s, which protects most of the shorelines from development, but it doesn't entirely protect the estuary from the effects of development in the watershed. And the watershed is heavily populated and developed, which means that the bay is facing a lot of water quality threats as well as threats from a large amount of boat traffic. Next slide, please. There are 6 species of seagrasses in Estero Bay. So every species of seagrass in Florida, minus the Johnson seagrass, which is only found on the east coast of Florida, can be found in Estero Bay. And historically, because of the bay's shallow depth, it's been an ideal habitat for seagrass. The earliest assessment of seagrass in Estero Bay that we have is from aerial photography photo interpretation from 1950, and it was estimated that there were about 1,500 hectares of seagrass in the bay at that time. Well, I have an asterisk around that because, you know, there's always uncertainty in those aerial photography measurements, especially when they're from really old aerial photos that weren't associated with any ground truthing. Seagrasses in Estero Bay are really important to the bay's biodiversity and to its fisheries. It's a recreational fishing hotspot. The seagrass has important positive effects on water quality in the bay, helps stabilize sediments and reduce turbidity. They can sequester nutrients and prevent harmful algal blooms. And for the aesthetics of the bay as well, it's part of the natural beauty of the environment. Despite all these benefits of seagrasses are quite sensitive to pollution and other types of environmental degradation. So we monitor seagrasses as a sort of to take the pulse of the health of the bay. And the two main monitoring methods, which I'll talk about more, are aerial photography-based methods, which lately are done by the South Florida Water Management District, and in-water transects, which are mostly done by the Florida Department of Environmental Protections with the Estero Bay Aquatic Preserve Office. Next slide, please. So some of the environmental concerns that can degrade and eliminate seagrass habitats include reductions in light availability. Seagrass, compared to seaweed, requires a lot of light. It requires, some of the species require about 25% of surface light intensity, which is a lot of light. And that means that they can't grow in deep waters. And if the water's murky, the depth that the seagrass is able to grow gets closer and closer to the surface until they're just pinched out of existence. So the depth target for seagrass habitat in Estero Bay is 1.6 meters, which means we want to ensure that 25% of surface light is making it down 1.6 meters deep. And that means that the light attenuation coefficient, K sub D, needs to be 0.9 per meter. So those are sort of our metrics for maintaining the light environment that we think will support seagrass in the bay. So some of the threats to those light levels are eutrophication. As nutrients enter the bay from the watershed, it increases phytoplankton blooms and also increases benthic algae and epiphytes, which can block light. Freshwater flow and salinity are big concerns for their impacts on seagrasses, oysters, and other benthic organisms in the Charlotte Harbor region, and those are factors in Estero Bay as well. For example, in the Hurricane Irma summer, salinity got extremely low in Estero Bay and reached zero in many parts of the bay that are normally relatively high salinity, and that has a direct impact. Those freshwater flows, of course, also introduce nutrients and sediments and other factors that reduce the optical water quality. And finally, there are physical disturbances to seagrasses in the bay. Sort of, it's the mixed blessing that the bay is shallow because it presents a lot of illuminated substrate for the seagrass to grow, but shallow also means that boats can scar the seagrasses easily there. Next slide, please. So there's some challenges to getting an accurate read on the seagrass abundance in the bay. So some of the challenges of the aerial photography are that it's an expensive operation that can't be done with high frequency. The frequency is less than annual. In fact, the most recent aerial photography effort for Estero Bay was in 2014. So it's sort of a 6-year gap that we're dealing with now. Also, there's time of year effects. Usually the monitoring is done in the winter when seagrass is less abundant and not in the summer due to water quality concerns. And there's also some challenges to interpreting that aerial photo data due to not only the murky water, but also the confounding of seagrass, macroalgae, and other types of benthic color that appear dark in the photos. So as another alternative type of monitoring that's done as well, there's in-water monitoring, and the Estero Bay Aquatic Preserve has been doing that with 5 fixed transect locations in the bay. And they do 5 to 10 quadrats per transect. So you're getting direct data that way, but it's a very small portion of the entire bay bottom that can be looked at with that level of detail. And that means that there's relatively low statistical power to detect year-to-year changes from those transect data. Next slide, please. A final challenge to the monitoring is when you do detect changes over time in seagrass, it's hard to interpret sometimes what's causing those changes and to isolate the causal factors. Next slide, please. All right, so with these challenges in mind, my graduate student, Lisa, set about synthesizing all of the existing monitoring data that she could get her hands on from the aerial photos and the in-water transects. And she also developed a new monitoring method that she thought might combine some of the strengths of both the in-water and the aerial methods, and she did a statistical analysis of that. So let's go to the next slide. So the aerial photography trend is interestingly mixed. If you look at total seagrass cover, it looks like it's been stable or increasing, but that's because there's been a big increase in the continuous seagrass cover category, a big increase in the patchy seagrass cover category over time, and the continuous seagrass cover category has actually declined to its lowest extent in 2014. Next slide, please. This is a map based on those most recent 2014 data, which show what looks like a fair amount of continuous and patchy seagrass cover in the bay, but we don't know if it's still like this because since 2014 we've had 2016 El Nino, 2017 Hurricane Irma, and the major red tides of 2018, and we would expect that those things may have decreased the seagrass cover. Next slide, please. The trend based on the in-water transects is not quite as sunny as the trend based on the aerial photos. We actually observed a minimum seagrass abundance in 2016, and when we add the 2017 and 2020 data, we'll hopefully see it creeping back up again, but it's very concerning that 2016, the most recent year that we've analyzed so far, was a minimum of seagrass. Next slide, please. So Lisa did many analyses to explore the relationships of the seagrass trends to environmental factors. And some of the things that she identified were salinity effects. There was more seagrass in dry, high salinity years than in wet, low salinity years. And there was a negative relationship with macroalgae cover. The more algae there was, the less seagrass there was. Another thing she found was a negative relationship between mean annual temperature and seagrass abundance. And mean annual temperature has been increasing over time. And I don't know if it's just a coincidence that temperature is going up and seagrass is going down, or if there's some physiological mechanism that's causing that to happen. One strange thing we found was a positive correlation between phosphorus concentrations and seagrass abundance, but correlation doesn't always imply causation, and we'll need to look in more detail at what might be going on there. Next slide, please. So in addition to these quantitative data, okay, so I need to wrap up here soon. I'm going too slow. In addition to the quantitative data, there's some qualitative trends that are worrying. One is that the seagrass seems to be sparser and more covered in algae, like this filamentous cyanobacteria, formerly known as Lingbia, now known as Dapis fluosa, is very abundant in some parts of the bay bottom. And there also seems to be increasing boat traffic in the bay. The effects of boat traffic on water quality, particularly turbidity, are actually visible as a weekday versus weekend turbidity difference in the aquatic preserves continuous monitoring data. Next slide, please. So the new monitoring method takes seagrass measurements and water quality measurements from all over the bay at 50 sites. Next slide, please. And some of the insights that we've gotten from this Lisa Rickards method are that there's a lot of macroalgae in the bay. In fact, there's much more macroalgae than there is seagrass. Next slide, please. Another insight is that we're not meeting the optical water quality targets in the bay, and the 2017 to 2018 season was worse than the 2011 to 2012 season. That might have something to do with Hurricane Irma creating really poor water quality conditions in the wet season. Next slide, please. Another thing that Lisa found was that overall the percent cover of seagrass is quite low in the bay, and it's variable seasonally. Some of the ephemeral species, Halophila and Halidule, are making up the majority of the seagrass abundance in the bay, and those really vary a lot within the season. Next slide, please. So currently we're doing another 2020 update on this monitoring. We've changed the method a little bit to bring it more in line with other methods that use 1 meter squared quadrats. And we're making sure that we're only looking at the sites that may have seagrass. Okay, next slide. We're also looking at some of the turbidity effects, and final slide. In the long term, we want to continue these monitoring efforts so that we can address these questions and threats to the Bay. Thanks.
Sorry to rush you there. I know these lightning talks go really fast. Unfortunately, we do not have time for Q&A this session. We are now about to start our next presentation. For those of you who do have questions for James, please use the contact information in the proceedings to reach out to him directly. With that, we're going to turn over to our next speaker from SCCF.